All right, so thanks for being here, everybody that's here, and especially return folks and regulars. And Mark, thank you very much for setting this up. And again, thank you to Wayne and the Institute of Ecolonomics for creating this opportunity and building and investing in building this giant network of education on protecting and restoring biodiversity and ecology in ways that are sensible from the environment's point of view, and also that make money for people, and creating an economy that's going to work for the environment over the long term. All right, so this is session 3 of a template for global biospheric restoration. Before we start on the new info, I thought we would just touch base really quickly on the big ideas. There's quite a few slides today. So in our process, what we began with in part 1 is an assessment at global scale, and our first 2 sessions covered these 3 big ideas. In the first piece, where do we come from? We looked at the history of life and just the reality of the historical record showing micro to macro in development of life. And that humanity is a very recent arrival to the biosphere of this planet. The biosphere began somewhere around 4 billion years ago as really simple microorganisms, and we showed up 200,000 to, depending on how conjecture-y you want to get, maybe 1 million years ago. In the second piece of this, and the big takeaway idea, was the reckoning that biodiversity creates life support services for us. It's not that the oxygen on Earth is always here. It's that respiration is creating oxygen, et cetera, et cetera. In session 2, we inserted this piece exploring restoration and whether or not it's really viable. And what we came away with were a few key ideas. One is describing what has been happening in the last couple of 100 years, roughly, as the negative transition of the biosphere, meaning that we've been destroying life way faster than it can replace itself, and we've been destroying ecological functionality by destroying ecosystems. And that's really what we're looking at today in part 1 of today. But that has been a negative transition that now really does jeopardize civilization's future, and more than that. And what we're going to do is engage a positive transition. What we want is to see humanity create more life than it destroys, and to engage that immediately. The other major takeaway piece from that is that we already have what we need to do this. That, you know, there are these conversations that are kind of popular about whether or not we can go to Mars and start a new planet. And, you know, from a very, very basic rationale, I mean, at the most reasonable level, it took 60 million years for this reality that we have now, this biosphere, to emerge based on an extinction crisis that began around 65 million years ago. And life is micro to macro. That Mars, for instance, not only doesn't have any microbial life as far as we can tell at any great scale or any pervasiveness, but it also doesn't have an atmosphere. You know, you would be starting at 0. You'd be starting at Earth 4 billion years ago, theoretically.
So we are going to start talking about green algae. I actually did talk a little, so I always go back just a little bit, just for your review. And this is one of the protist groups that is plant-like, if you remember. And so this is the green algae, very important in aquatic systems. And as we talk about all the more broad elements of aquatic ecology, we'll talk a lot more about green algae. They're unicellular, most of them, not all of them. Some form colonies. Here's an example of a microscopic view of a colony. So each of these are separate cells. And this is a colony. Here's a bigger macroscopic view of a colony. Here's another colony that's formed. There are a few that are multicellular. They can live in both fresh and salt water, so there are lots of saltwater green algae also. We're just concerned and interested in freshwater versions. And they're very closely related to the plant community that we're going to start talking about today. So I talked about a volvox, which is a hollow bowl composed of hundreds of flagellated cells. So those are all the cells that you're seeing in there. This is an example of a flagellated form of a green algae, just a popular one called Chlamydomonas, and we'll talk about that species later. So this is now where we're getting into new material. This is brown algae, commonly called seaweed. They can contain lots of different colors, so they don't always look brown, but they'll be a little brownish. They can be brown in color, green, yellow, orange, black. They have all kinds of pigments. They will attach to substances, typically rocks, usually in the ocean, although they'll attach to sand also. They have air bladders, which would cause them to be able to float and move towards the surface. There's an example of a bladder. Some can be just huge. And they're not just used as food thickeners. They are literally the second most eaten object that we have from water in the world. If anybody can put in what the first most eaten object, so we would call it a seafood, it could be from freshwater or saltwater, is, I'll give you a prize of some kind.
So today, just very briefly, we're going to talk about what we know about women and money. You can keep going. And we're also going to talk about the risks. It's a little bit of a downer, but I promise I won't leave you there. And lastly, how the industry is responding to women. Because this is a very interesting thing, because I'll just 1 second on this. Women in general, all across the globe, manage more money than men do. They own more small businesses than men do. And so the financial services industry, forget about retail. Retail is all over that. But financial services industry has decided to really pay attention and to try to understand why women are really not engaged in their financial lives. And so that's the teaser. So before we get to the nitty-gritty of the presentation, though, I kind of want to ask a question to the audience, because, and this is for the men too. Anyone that you know in your life that's a woman, this is some insight into how they process, but it's also a little bit true for men as well. But that when we talk about, we can be successful family members, successful business people, successful in our community, in sports, in all kinds of avenues. So we have the skills to manage our money. There's no doubt about that. There are some tactical things you might not know, but that's easy to learn. But there's something about the words, especially for women. So I'm going to ask you, what do you feel like when I say financial planning or investing or managing your own money, being your own financial planner?
Julie, one of the things that I'm really interested in, as I mentioned, is cancer, and that's one of our focuses. What is the main thing that we can do, men and women? I know your specialty is women, but to help rid this toxic load that we all are invaded with every day. I mean, we get this terrible toxic load from dust particles, from makeup, from hair products, from the food we eat, water we drink, the air we breathe. Where do you start?
Well, the way that I always explain it to people, and I call it my bucket theory. So I tell everybody that, you know, they're a bucket, and we all have things going into our bucket. You know, the things in our food, the things in our air, the things in our water, the things in our products, the things in our environment. You know, all of this is constantly affecting us. You know, we live in a pretty rural area, and so my husband was driving down the street, and the farm, I mean, basically a couple blocks from us, had one of those huge trucks, and it was, you know, those sprayers on each side just spraying, and he's like, you know, making his windows go up as quick as he can, you know, driving through this stuff. But it's like, none of us, and even if he wasn't driving down that road that day, you know, none of us live in bubbles. None of us can escape this kind of stuff. So it is there. So what we can personally do, I think, is do as much as we can, you know, do as much as we can. First of all, not to put so many things in that bucket. You know, do you actually need all of those things that you're using on your body, in your home, that kind of thing? And, you know, I was going to talk about this when we were talking about the dust particles, but I'll have women who, you know, have their homes cleaned by a cleaning service. And so the cleaning service will use chemicals, but the woman won't use chemicals herself. And I always try to explain, it's just as bad. You know, it's still in your house. And now that I know this, you know, 10-day dust drop little factoid, that's incredible. I mean, it's still in your house. So, you know, getting those things out of your house. So, I mean, and when I say that, when I first did this, it was like I tried to do the vinegar baking soda cleaning thing, and that was not for me, because I actually really wanted a nice clean house. You know, I didn't want my house to smell like vinegar and like the surfaces to be kind of sticky and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I really looked into like finding a good company that, you know, I could trust and use their cleaning products and all that kind of stuff that would actually work and clean my house, because I do have 4, you know, crazy, sticky, dirty little kids. So they need to be cleaned up after. So that's just cleaning, but, you know, the amount of things that go in your bucket in the first place.
In a real brief overview of what it is, basically, the immune system is a system that's designed to ward off any pathogen that comes in, whether it be bacteria, viruses, toxins, parasites, even mutant cancer cells or mutant cells, which is cancer. So all those things happen in our body on a daily basis, on an instantaneous basis. All of us that are watching this right now have probably inhaled some pathogen just breathing the air, and our immune system goes to work right away to fight that off. Okay, so Dad, what I want to do now is I want to go to talking about, first off, breaking it down. I mentioned that there's an innate system, an adaptive system that are part of the immune system. I don't want to go there yet. I want to first go to the organs that are involved in our immune system. And so let me go grab another screen here. Hopefully you see how does your immune system protect you up there with a cool little picture of a guy with some neon pathogens coming his way and his hands out there stopping it. Well, as I mentioned, the skin is one of the ways that that's done, but there are some organs that we have in our body and that I want to share with you, and let's talk a little bit about each organ and how that works, and I'm going to kind of turn this over to my dad at this point. So here are let me put up the next slide. These are the basic organs of the immune system. There are a few others that play in. I already mentioned the gut bacteria and stuff through the intestine, and there's different areas there, but these are the main ones. So we have our thymus gland, and a lot of people, quite frankly, don't even know or haven't even heard that they have a thymus gland. Very important. It's the central gland of our immune system. It's a little gland that's right here in our chest and right next to our heart. So that kind of tells you the importance of that. We have a bone marrow, and some people don't really think of that as an organ, but it is, and that's where many of the cells are created on a daily basis. Millions and millions of cells every day are created in the bone marrow. We have a spleen, which is a filtering aspect gland, and the lymph nodes, which is also a filtering organ.
So what I'm going to do now is maybe try to find some continuity in what we've learned and bring it into some different scenarios. And one of the things that I have a particular expertise towards is indoor growing. I owned a hydroponic store for 15 years, and am a consultant to indoor agricultural growers all over the country. So you know, a lot of my expertise is in soil fertility. It's a lot of where my passion lies. I'm not necessarily what you would call a proponent of hydroponic controlled environment agriculture, but I'm also, you know, we can't shy away from its necessity. And I would put, you know, a layer of discussion around the idea of, you know, anything grown in an artificial environment typically is going to be eaten closer to where it's grown than something grown in a field on balance. And the reason for that is the people that do it understand the ability to create an environment within a localized environment. There's a lot, or location I should say, there's a lot of value that is lost in shipping food thousands of miles. Not only in the waste of getting it from A to B, but in the nutritional benefit of what's being eaten. You know, 15 minutes separated from a root, food begins to break down enzymatically, and it's losing its life force and its nutritional value. And you know, we'll talk about that in some expansion next week. I think I want to do a session on wheatgrass. I was a commercial wheatgrass grower for about a decade. Had unbelievable experiences with people healing all sorts of different afflictions with living foods. So, you know, we'll get into that next week. But, you know, so we've kind of come through, you know, all of the bioenergetic platform. You know, the effort being creating a platform for discussion. It's a living concept. It's never going to be defined. It's not the point. And the conversation is designed to generate perspective in order to facilitate action. And that's really is my hope and was my insight and what's turned into my work. And I feel very blessed to be able to sit here and talk to you guys and with you guys about these things, because you know, I live and breathe this every day. And you know, today we're going to talk about controlled environment agriculture. And what happens a lot, you know, I've got a Facebook page, Bioenergetic Agriculture. If you haven't sought it out, please do join the conversation. But, you know, there's a lot of what I will call with zero judgment purists in regards to how food should be grown.
Have a sense for balance, you'd fall over. Temperature, we all know when we're getting hot and cold, or if something else is hot or cold, well then people argue, oh, temperature is just a, you know, it's a census. Number 5.2.1, echolocation. Well, excuse me, you don't think that you can clap your hands and kind of tell how far away you are from something, or in what direction a reflective object is, or electroreception? You don't think that you can get close to an electric fence and sense that it's on? Does your hair stand up on end? Do you get a smell near electricity? What about hygroreception? Do you know? Can you sense when something is wet or dry? Fascinating. Here's an interesting clip to go to. When we're observing things, there's also different biases that we have. I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but I have before. I've gone to a class, you know, in high school or college or whatever, and I was late for class, and I knew I was going to, let's say, you know, physics 101 or whatever it is, and I go running into class, and it's a different professor. It's like, oh, cool, we must have a guest professor now. And then the professor starts talking about something totally different than the subject that I was supposed to be in there learning about. And it took about half the class for me to finally say, you know what, I'm in the wrong class. Whereas you have this idea in your mind that this is a class I'm supposed to be at, and you keep looking for confirmation. It's a confirmation bias. Confirmation, I'm in the right place, I'm in the right place, I'm in the right place, I'm in the right place. If I had only observed, looked around that classroom, noticed that it wasn't the classroom that I was in yesterday, that the people weren't the same students that were there yesterday. Obviously, the teacher was different, the subject matter was different. There was a zillions, tons of information telling me that I was in the wrong place. But this preconceived notion, this concept kept me there, sitting there, and I was late for my other class. Go see this YouTube video sometime. There are people bouncing a basketball. What you have to do is pay attention to the people wearing white clothes, white shirts, and see how many times the people in white shirts pass a basketball to one another. It's a fascinating exercise in observational skills, because what they'll start to do is they start mixing all around, and they bounce the basketball back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then a real obvious one right here is I'm going to get most people on this right here. I apologize for the rather undressed lady on the front, but 100% of the men didn't even notice that King Kong is in this picture. So we need to learn how to observe through all this clutter, observe without biases, observe without our concepts getting in the way. And then one other thing that's as significant as anything in the whole permaculture design that has really made a difference for me is we're going to design from the pattern to details. By stepping back and looking at huge patterns in nature and society, etc., they form the basis, the background of our whole entire design that we're implementing. And the details are something we fill in later on. They're site-specific to wherever you are, whether they're Colorado or Croatia or Ontario, etc. But the patterns will be recognizable just about anywhere we go on the planet. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, maybe even the next week or two.
It's important to remember that these simple practices of knotting fiber together or weaving fiber together, that as we engage in these arts, we are creating something that is tied to historic traditions that go back really to the Neolithic period, and that we're making these things is not only for our bodies, but there's very much something soulful and cellularly charged about this work. So it is the work of our ancestors. And just to refrain on the problem statement, I'll go through this briefly because I know this is a proactive group who wants to focus on the solutions. But we do have a challenge when we are purchasing clothing from mainstream sources, from kind of the larger global industrial models. 80% of the workers in the industry are women, but the top 15 grossing international fast fashion brands, none of these companies have female CEOs. There's a lot of inequity in the system that goes down to the milling. Here's GMO cotton being milled in Bangladesh, and we really only have 1% guarantee on all the clothing made globally in this multiple trillion dollar industry. Only 1% of the garments are considered fair trade, which means we're giving people a wage that's commensurate with a living wage for their culture and community. And we don't really have verification that this is happening on 99% of the clothes that are purchased. And so really it comes down to this. There's an anonymity in the supply chain. We don't really know who, what, where, and why. We know why. We're consuming it. We want to consume it. But for the consumer, it is virtually impossible to know whether a product was manufactured in safe conditions. And this is the Rana Plaza factory, where a sewing factory collapsed and killed 1,100 people in Bangladesh. I believe this was in 2013. The other thing we have to just consider in our clothing.
If you're in an extremely cold environment and you really decide you want to do solar thermal hot water, then evacuated tube is almost certainly the way to go. And in the mid latitudes, you have some choices and options that you need to look at. Okay. you know. So that kind of just tells you, you really have to look at the environment you're installing in to determine what type of collector is going to make more sense to you, for you, okay? So the next piece part of the choices are whether we're going to use a passive or active system. Passive or thermosiphon systems are going to use convective circulation instead of a pump to circulate the water. And you can see here, this diagram, what you do is you're putting the hot water tank physically higher than the collector. And the reason is you want the cooler water from the bottom of the hot water tank to go downhill, be pulled down by this convective current, and then to be heated up in the collector and then pushed back up as it expands into the hot water tank. And that is a passive or thermosiphon system. These kinds of systems can work very well in tropical climates. What you're seeing here is also what's called direct system, which we're going to get into in a minute, which basically means that we are running the hot water directly through the solar collector. And so this is a very simple system, but it does require that you have the capability of physically supporting your hot water tank up high. And what you're going to see is in a number of off-grid situations in the tropics and subtropics, these systems work very, very well. You can put the hot water tank up pretty high. You can put the solar collector down below it. And then if you put the hot water tank up high enough, then you can actually get enough water pressure out of just the drop off of the hot water tank down to your points of use for that to be reasonable.
So talk a little bit about what you do with pediatrics. I know that that was one of your areas that you particularly like and focus on. Mm-hmm. What are some of the areas that you're seeing with children, and what are some of the areas that you feel that you're able to really make an impact with children?
Mm-hmm. Some of the things that I noticed, well, is really the exposure to, and it goes back to environmental medicine. That's also one of my passions. Okay, so you'll have to excuse me, but no. A lot of the exposure to not only heavy metals really, but more specifically like plastics are concerning because it causes endocrine disruption. So we're seeing a lot of children who are developing type 2 diabetes at the age of 8, or a lot of girls who are starting their menstruation at the age of 8.
Wow.
And that's significantly earlier than it was 20 years ago, whereas the average start of menses was maybe 12, 13. So that's like 5 years earlier. And, you know, I'm sure there's other causes as well as the hormones in beef children are eating. So, but also the plastics, really, it's like a lot of plastics that we eat. Anyways, that is a huge thing that I'm seeing with children. And a lot of the parents who bring their kids to me, they frequently don't want their kids to be vaccinated as well. So that's another big issue that I see on occasion. They ask about vaccine schedules. It's a huge issue, I'm sure, in California as well with the vaccine law. Yeah, it's mandated now.
Mandated for children in school. It's kind of, to me, it's personally kind of scary. It seems like you're taking away our rights as far as some of them go here in the United States to conform consent. I mean, we don't have that informed consent. We don't have that law, or in California anyway, because they're saying to go to school, you have to have vaccines, which is mind-blowing to me. But what's your take on vaccines? And before you go into that, I'd like to step back. Young children that come in that are having some of these early onset normal body functions, but they're so much earlier. Is there anything that you can do to help them? Or is that just something that they're too far gone at that point already at 8 years old? That's scary.
No, I don't think they're too far gone. Really, the other part that comes into the component is educating the parent. And most of the time, the parents are really diligent about trying to reduce exposure, and they really want to help their kid. The other part to trying to help these children with their hormones and their endocrine, other than cleaning up the diet and trying to clean up their exposures, is also trying to boost like their immune systems. Basically, what I try to do is give them the minimum amount that they need to take, but to have the maximum impact.